Thank you all for joining today. We are here to engage in a crucial discussion about democracy, human rights, and the current political landscape in Nicaragua. As many of you might know, Nicaragua has faced many political challenges lately, and in these times, it is vital that we listen to many voices that can give us some perspectives on the situation. It's my great honor to introduce Mr. Félix Maradiaga. Drawing from his personal experience and expertise, Mr. Maradiaga will explore how democratic organizations worldwide can effectively collaborate to counter the growing influence of autocracies. He will delve into the synergies between democracies, the importance of building strong and robust networks among NGOs, and the strategic formation of political alliances. By sharing innovative approaches and practical strategies, Mr. Maradiaga aims to provide a comprehensive blueprint for creating a resilient democratic ecosystem capable of withstanding and overcoming autocratic challenges. The talk aspires to inspire and equip democratic entities to build a world where democratic ideals thrive and autocratic regimes are effectively countered through unified and collaborative efforts. It is my great honor to introduce Mr. Félix Maradiaga. His insights and experiences are invaluable as we reflect on the challenges and opportunities facing Nicaragua today. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Félix Maradiaga to the stage.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here at this STEAM institution, a beacon of excellence and a testament to both American and international commitment to public service. I extend my gratitude to Dean John Sherman and Professor Andrew Natsios for their invitation, and of course to Dr. Silva Hami for facilitating the Q&A section after this talk, to the distinguished faculty, and the dedicated staff, and especially to the students who bring such a vitality to this remarkable institution. The moment one steps onto this campus, there is a tangible sense of optimism, a quality all too rare in our world today. I want to speak with you about the critical need for civil society organizations worldwide to work more closely together on strategies and tactics to halt the spread of authoritarianism. My focus is not on alliances among democratic governments or on public policies aimed at bolstering democracy against attacks on fundamental freedoms. Not because these are unimportant. On the contrary, the role of governments and multilateral agencies is essential. However, I want to focus on the civic responsibility that we, as private citizens, hold both individually and through organizations such as collaborative networks, think tanks, social movements, student groups, youth movements, and of course, universities, whose role is far greater than we often realize. But before I continue, allow me to speak from the heart and share my personal story to underscore the importance of international collaboration in the defense of freedom. As someone who painfully experienced the wounds of tyranny from a young age, standing here before you carry immense emotional weight. Just over a year ago, I was released from arbitrary detention by the Nicaraguan dictator Daniel Ortega after announcing my intention to run for the presidency in my country, Nicaragua. I was arrested on June 8, 2021, and placed in a maximum security facility under conditions so inhumane that I still struggle to speak of them publicly. For over 611 days, I was confined to El Chipote, cutting me off entirely from the outside world. No books were allowed, not even a Bible, which led my wife, Berta, to launch an international campaign, A Bible for Felix. now an emblematic call for religious freedom. Our campaign has been nominated to the Nobel Peace Prize. It's a big team of the work that they did. In those cells, prayer was prohibited, and I was denied access to reading or writing materials, not even a letter from my daughter. My 4 lawyers were forced, all of them, into exile. And one of them was in prison, Roger Reyes, for over a year under conditions of torture, simply for defending me. When Roger was released, he couldn't even remember the names of his 2 daughters. Yet, through the bipartisan efforts of the United States, the Ortega regime was pressured into releasing us. However, not without first declaring me stateless, a traitor to the homeland, the Supreme Court of Nicaragua argued, because of my close links to American academic institutions, stripping me of my nationality and deporting me to the United States. When I was arrested and sentenced to 13 years in prison in a secret trial held inside the prison without a court, my wife launched a global campaign demanding my release. The hatred of the dictatorship against me, which had even attempted to assassinate me twice, made my release seem almost impossible. Yet I am here today thanks to the tireless efforts of my wife, the love of my life, who rallied support from every corner of the world, searching into every network. Former colleagues during my times in private sector, friends from various organizations I have served, our church community. She is an evangelical Christian, I'm a Catholic, so they came together to try to advocate for my release. Political parties, both from the left and the right in the US and in Europe. She even achieved an unprecedented task of uniting the alumni clubs of Yale and Harvard to work on my behalf. But on a more serious note, I must also thank my Lord and Savior, Jesus. The lesson learned is that global democratic solidarity does work. I want to convey that message to you. Global democratic solidarity does work. When people of goodwill come together for a shared purpose, united more by shared values than by the differences that separate us, humanity can accomplish great things. So I stand here today as a result of a miracle, knowing that some of my fellow prisoners did not survive. Expelled from my own country, I arrived in the United States on February 9, 2023, together with 221 other deported political prisoners. But my connection with the United States and with Texas in particular is deeper than recent events. I am born and raised in Nicaragua, but I'm the grandson of an American citizen who instilled in me a profound admiration for the founders of this country and the ideals that make it a global symbol of freedom and democracy. At 12 years old, I was forced to flee Nicaragua, escaping the persecution of the Marxist Sandinista regime in 1988, and initially found refuge in Texas, in Harlingen, a city not far from here. Initially, I was sheltered in a center for victims of communism on the US-Mexican border, and later briefly by a Nicaraguan American family who opened their doors for me. I later moved to Miami for 2 years to live with another foster parent family. In 1990, I returned to Nicaragua, eager to help rebuild a democratic country. Violeta Barrios de Chamorro has just won the first free and fair elections, a pivotal moment in our history. As a young man, I began a career in public service in 1997, eventually overseeing the national programs for disarmament, arms control, and reintegration of former combatants. For a decade, during our democratic period, I worked diligently to strengthen national security relations between Nicaragua and the United States Southern Command. Ortega returned to power in 2007. I left government immediately to pursue an academic career abroad, but upon seeing the rapid deterioration of the fledgling democratic institutions we had built with so many efforts during the brief democratic experience, I decided to return home in Nicaragua to build the resistance for freedom in my country. We speak of democratic solidarity and the defense of freedom. It is essential to illustrate that this is not merely a geopolitical mission. It is rather a profound duty for the future of humanity. According to the latest report by Freedom House, the world has endured 18 consecutive years of democratic erosion. Only 1 in 5 people worldwide lives in a free country. while the remaining 80% of the world is subject to partial or complete authoritarianism, as is the case for the 53 autocracies according to Freedom House. These aren't just numbers. Around 1 million people worldwide are political prisoners, detained simply for exercising their right to speak, think critically, or peaceful protest. There are voices like those of more than 40 political opponents in Nicaraguan prisons, 1,000 political prisoners in Cuba or others across the world whose stories speak to the resilience of the human spirit against repression. Take, for example, Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, or opposition leaders like Janine Áñez and Luis Fernando Camacho in Bolivia, Michael Castillo Perez, a young Cuban hip-hop artist who emerged defiantly from Cuba's artistic underground to confront a regime bent on censoring free expression. Or Fabiola Tercero, my friend, a journalist in Nicaragua who was arrested and held incommunicado for standing against the closure of the Jesuit University in Managua. Or Server Mustayev, a member of Ukraine's Crimean Tatar minority who was convicted by a Russian court on terrorism just for helping others, his friends, who are wrongfully convicted in occupied Crimea. There's also Sofia Alagaz, a journalist imprisoned in Turkey, where being a journalist is challenging enough. But being a woman, reporting on human rights abuses by Turkish security forces take courage to another level entirely. Shortly after leaving prison, I was invited by Ukrainian organizations to visit recently liberated territories. I met teenagers in Kyiv who had been abducted when they were only children by Russian forces, and I spoke with Ukrainian survivors of Russian detention. My role as president of the Latin American Classical Liberal Network and my work with the World Liberty Congress puts me in close contact with dissidents and political prisoners worldwide. A footnote on this is that liberalism in the international context has, as I've been told, a different connotation that it has domestically in the US. I am convinced beyond shadow of a doubt that the patterns of repression, the tactics of torture, spy, disinformation, propaganda, and attacks against the United States and its allies are not coincidence. Autocracies today collaborate with unprecedented coordination. Reminiscent of this is the Soviet era during the height of the Cold War. The network of tyrants is not an alliance bound by ideology, considering the vast difference between nationalist Russia, communist China, socialist Venezuela, and theocratic Syria and Iran, but rather by shared interests. These dictatorships are ideologically agnostic. Anna Applebaum likens their relationship to that of a large multinational corporation. Each regime maintains its internal policies and individual interests, yet collectively they pursue a set of common goals, many of which are financial. These regimes engage in mutual transactions. China sells surveillance equipment to members of this autocratic club. Russia supplies arms and occasionally mercenaries. Beyond these economic exchanges, they also cooperate militarily, share intelligence, and support each other's narratives. These regimes are often kleptocratic in nature. The leading members of these autocratic networks is, of course, China, Russia, and Iran. They are more influential and they are more aggressive at the global stage. But Venezuela, Cuba, in Latin America, along Ortega's Nicaragua, though less influential, are part of this network. In Africa, countries like Central African Republic and Mali are heavily influenced by Russia. Historically, we have transitioned from the ideological struggle of the Cold War between communism and free markets to a new struggle where the distinctions between left and right have become less relevant. Instead, we now witness anti-democratic forces aligning across borders, both in the democratic backsliding within nations and among autocracies. These phenomena are interconnected. It is a battle between those who believe in unchecked executive power and those who advocate for check and balances, the rule of law, and greater citizens' influence. Addressing this challenge is a monumental task. This statement, while provocative, reflects a perspective grounded in what is called modernization theory, basically the idea that countries will automatically become democratic by becoming developed. We have learned that that's not true. The literature of the decline of democracy is extensive, covering economic and developmental perspective. For example, Acemoglu and Robinson is an example of that perspective. But we also see insight from scholars like Larry Diamond or Chris Walker. In their Journal of Democracy, they coined the term sharp power to describe the influence of China and other autocracies as erosion of democracy in the West through disinformation and even electoral interference in democratic countries. Experts like René Di Resta have focused on the destructive role of social media in creating disinformation and polarization. When I interviewed a dear friend, Francis Fukuyama, and said, I'm going to deliver a lecture, could you give me one quote? What can we do to save democracy? And he said, get off social media. My dear friend William Dobson has offered a masterful explanation of how dictators go through what he calls a learning curve, becoming increasingly sophisticated, manipulating public opinion, and by giving people a facade of democracy. However, I would like to shift our attention to the individual and make a call to our personal responsibility to defend freedom within our most immediate realities. Democracy cannot survive if we wait passively for governments to lead the fight for freedom on our behalf. There is a civic duty, deeply rooted in the democratic tradition and on history. Each of us must stand as a guardian of liberty, acting to protect democratic values in our own communities, workplaces, universities, and institutions. How is it that well-intentioned people vote for autocrats around the world who dismantle democratic institutions upon coming to power? How do rational individuals support policies that erode individual freedoms and under the guise of collective well-being, they dehumanize our society? The answer lies in large parts in the radically divergent sources of information shaping modern society understanding of concepts like freedom and democracy. The grand post-Cold War consensus famously leading Francis Fukuyama to declare the end of history is no longer there. Without a shared foundation to build a consensus on the model of a state and society we want, it becomes impossible to sustain a social contract, much less defended from the increasingly camouflaged and sophisticated attacks by freedom enemies, as Dobson argues in Dictator's Learning Curve. This reflection recalls a powerful concept studied by Peter Berger and Thomas Lockman in their 1966 book, The Social Construction of Reality. Berger and Lockman argued that social reality is not something that simply falls from the sky. All knowledge, including the most basic, taken-for-granted knowledge of everyday reality, is derived and sustained through social interactions. In other words, our personal definitions of principles such as political ideologies are not merely derived from formal education acquired in institutions, but primarily shaped by what they call primarily socializations. The books we read, the friends we have, the networks we belong. I believe we can all agree that much of the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism can be attributed to the fact that the fundamental ideas of communism were never quite cool. Think about this. The Soviets never argued that they were fighting democracy and freedom. They argued that they were fighting imperialism, implicitly acknowledging the soft power, the attraction of the ideas of free markets and capitalism. Traditional analysis of the deterioration of democracy often focus on the weakening of electoral process, the erosion of public trust in political parties, or the perceived exhaustion of democracy in the face of alternative governance model centers around strong leadership that promises results instead of freedom. However, a less conventional yet increasingly accepted analysis among activists posits that just as there was a surge in the appeal of democracy and social justice, there is something that some scholars call illiberal ideas. These ideas have found fertile ground even in parts of the world once considered secure in their commitment to freedom. This phenomenon has significant cultural components that extend beyond the political sphere. Social media, as Fukuyama argues, played a crucial role in normalizing and spreading these ideas. The image of autocratic leaders such as Vladimir Putin has become a symbol of power and determination that resonates with large segments of the global population. The famous image of Putin riding a bear, through often a caricature, encapsulates the perception of firm and decisive leadership that contrasts with the perceived inefficacy and weakness of participatory democratic leadership. Félix Maradiaga, in his influential essay, The Rise of Illiberal Democracy, warned of these dangers. While formally respecting electoral processes, illiberal leaders lack the values that ensure individual rights and the rule of law. This illiberalism, to take a term by Zakaria, has gained grounds as citizens disillusioned with the lack of tangible results seek alternatives that promise order and stability, even at the expense of freedom and plurality. The agnostic nature of this phenomenon, its ability to manifest in both the right and the left, reflects a deeper disillusionment with the fundamental principles of democracy. The attraction of the strongman is not just a symptom of democratic decline, but also a catalyst for its acceleration. This erosion of democracy is also closely tied to a weakening acceptance of democratic values. According to the Cambridge Center for the Future of Democracy, in 2005, only 2015 to 38.7% of citizens expressed dissatisfaction with democracy. Since then, only within 5 years, this has increased to 57.5% globally. This observation aligns with the findings of the Pew Research Center here in the US, which highlights a similar decline. Satisfaction with democracy in 12 high-income democratic countries has decreased in recent years. While not the absolute solution to everything, the most important strategy is the creation of a pro-democracy ecosystem that connects institutions worldwide in pursuit of concrete, common goals, such as the defense of freedom of expression or global human rights campaigns like those advocating for the release of political prisoners and combating disinformation from Russia and China. In this, universities in democratic countries play a central role. This is what I refer to as building a democratic ecosystem, which can also be described as transnational activism. The concept of transnational pro-democracy activism encompasses a broad spectrum of actions, strategies, collaborations. Unlike localized activism, which primarily addresses domestic issues, transnational pro-democracy activism extends into the international sphere. Transnational pro-democracy activism is distinguished by its capacity to coordinate efforts and mobilize resources at multiple levels, both local, national, and international. These activists understand that the struggle for democracy in various countries is interconnected, and that strengthening democratic values in one context can have positive ripple effects in others. In this framework, social movements, NGOs, youth organizations, and other civic organizations play a crucial role as vehicles for promoting democracy. There are various types of transnational pro-democracy networks. Some of them may be called coalition networks. Some of them are solidarity networks, knowledge and training networks, social movements, advocacy networks, digital networks. I will not go into details. I've been studying them for years, but their common characteristics that they span across multiple countries, enabling the coordination of efforts on a global scale. These networks are vital for addressing cross-border issues such as human rights violations and the promotion of democracy. These diverse types of transnational democracy activist networks illustrate the complexity of building global society in responding to the challenges posed by authoritarianism. The infrastructure established to support democracy globally was initially conceived in a benign context with the winds of global democratization at its back. Many of the legal, structural, and practical conditions were designed for environments where autocracies did not possess the level of sophistications they have today. It is now clear that supporting transnational activists will require greater innovation and an agile and adaptive attitude, not only from donors, from international institutions, from universities, from allied democratic governments, from the media and the activists themselves, but from all the components of what I call the global democratic ecosystem. The risk and difficulties encountered by various transnational pro-democracy activists is complex. The lack of adequate funding is frequently cited as the most common bottleneck by activists and leaders. However, the challenge of funding is not unique, nor is the most severe, and is evident that autocracies are becoming more sophisticated and more repressive. Also, these mechanisms have been extensively studied. It is important to highlight the concerning rise of transnational repression, which means that activists are being repressed, persecuted, not only inside their borders, but when pro-democracy activists are forced into exile, these autocracies continue to incarcerate family members of political prisoners back home in order to hold them hostages and force activists once in exile not to have a voice. Also, we see political leadership being forced into exile. A couple of decades ago, being an opposition leader in exile was something rare. Today, if you look into these 53 autocracies around the world, most of the robust voices against autocracies are forced into exile. Also, there is the challenge that the conditions of activists are more vulnerable. For example, activists around the world, once they are forced into exile, have difficulty finding a nationality. There are 5 countries, Nicaragua is one of them, that declare their opposition leaders stateless. So it's almost impossible for us to get a passport, to get another nationality. Asylum-seeking laws do not know how to handle with a stateless person. There are issues of mental health, the conditions of surviving torture. Finally, one of the most concerning challenges, as I've been studying through a network called the World Liberty Congress, is the ideological polarization that permeates these networks. Because when you're forced into exile, you are welcome into a country, but these countries, democratic, both in Europe and the US, are polarized. So it's inevitable for activists that you are absorbed into the domestic polarization of the host countries. And that makes it more difficult for you as a transnational activist to continue to work. Not only because it is entirely within the activist responsibility to try to build common ground, meaning that dictators cannot be blamed for the ideological polarizations sometimes faced by pro-democracy activists, but also because it is a challenge that can be resolved with sufficient will, dedication, discipline, and commitment. It seems obvious that building common cause is a fundamental mechanism, but in the context of these attacks, it is an increasingly complex challenge. The landscape for transnational pro-democracy activist networks is fraught with significant challenges that threaten their effectiveness and sustainability. From sophisticated repression by autocratic regimes, such as cyber attacks and so on, like resources disparity, ideological polarization, these networks face obstacles that require collaborative solutions. Understanding and addressing these challenges is crucial for enhancing the resilience and impact of transnational democracy networks. Only by recognizing these hurdles and actively working to overcome them can these networks hope to sustain their crucial role in promoting democracy globally in an increasingly complex and polarized environment. At this crucial juncture, building common cause among pro-democracy activists worldwide is just not a strategy, it's a necessity. Our goal is ambitious but achievable: to spark a fourth wave of democratization and to create a world grounded in the core values of individual freedom and human dignity. Yet, the spread of polarization severely hampers our efforts. When we allow our differences to overshadow our shared purpose, we weaken the very foundations upon which democratic collaboration rests. This moment calls us to move beyond divisions and to forge alliances, transcending ideological divides for the sake of our common values. The United States has historically been a beacon of democracy, and as we seek to reclaim the ideals that inspire global movements for freedom, we look to America to uphold its legacy. In the words of George H.W. Bush, in crucial things, unity. In important things, diversity. In all things, generosity. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was very informative, and I'm sure many of the audience here would like to ask some questions. So we have some people who were able to zoom in, so they asked some questions. I'll start with a couple, and then we'll take questions from the audience. One question is about the main obstacle to reach coordination among the Nicaraguan opposition to the regime.
The main obstacle is that Nicaragua, as any other country that has gone a civil war, has deep wounds from the civil conflict. Nicaragua just ended its civil war in 1990. Just imagine, I'm going to use a respectful comparison. We can still see in many parts of the world, Europe, the US one of them, that still have some open wounds from its own external struggle. Just imagine a country that 30 years ago was fighting among themselves. So you have Nicaraguans that sided with the Sandinista. You have Nicaraguans that were on the other side, fighting or supporting the Contra-revolutionary movement, the Contra supported by the Reagan administration. But Ortega now is persecuting both. Ortega is attacking his own former colleagues, sending to prison former generals of the army, even putting his own brother into house arrest. And of course, there are people like myself who've been opposing the Sandinistas since I ever remember. Since, you know, my mother, in my original version of this talk, I had an anecdote that my mother will try to smuggle from the US magazines and comics from the US so I could understand that the US was not the enemies of humanity. We were forced to recite in school that America was the enemy of humanity. But now you see Nicaraguans who fought against each other, both against Ortega. So building that common ground in a country that has gone through civil war is very, very hard. I think that the solution is very complex, but I'll do the summary of the strategy. It's basically focusing on things that you can resolve once you're a democracy. So let me give you an example. You have, for example, Nicaraguans who come from a very progressive tradition, and they believe that Ortega, since Ortega has, I wouldn't use the word reinvented, but Ortega now argues that he's a converted Catholic, so he has launched some of the most ultra-conservative laws against reproductive rights. So you have some people that do not want to touch upon the issue of reproductive rights in Nicaragua. I'm touching on this very controversial issue just to give you an example, right? And then you have anti-Ortega activists that come from the feminist movement, but they do not feel comfortable working alongside, let's say, faith-based groups. You know? So Ortega, I think he's a hypocrite. I don't think he believes in any of this. It's basically manipulation of laws to divide society. So using that example, when I'm asked about this, obviously as a person of faith, I think it's quite obvious where I stand on this issue, but I said, let's discuss this issue once we are a democracy. Because we cannot allow a dictator to bring the discussion to public policies when we don't have even the fundamental right to elect. We cannot go to elections. We don't even have a free press. So there are issues that are immediate. The freedom of political prisoners, reestablishing the right to a nationality, having the capacity to have a political movement that can work inside the country, and going to free and fair elections. Once we have those fundamental agreements, and I think I'm using the Nicaraguan case, but it applies to other autocracies around the world, we can go into more sophisticated issues of public policies. So that would be my
advice, suggestion. Very good, thank you. Another question, an interesting question. What are the remaining options for the US to combat autocracy here at home following the Supreme Court's decision to grant immunity to all presidents?
Well, as a person who has been welcomed into this country as a guest on humanitarian grounds, I'm very disciplined not to issue opinions on domestic policy, but I can respond on a more generic way. Yeah. When I see both sides of the political spectrum attacking each other with really extreme labels, I think it's important for me to say the following. I am hopeful of the US because I think that most Americans do not really see or understand, because they have not lived in a communist country or of autocracies, how robust American institutions are. I don't think there's such thing as one side being socialist or communist and the other one being fascist. I think those are broad exaggerations. This is a democracy. It's a robust democracy. It's a shining city on the hill, and it has its problems, and they will be resolved through the institutions, which are robust. So I think we have to have faith on the legacy of the founding fathers, and just hope and pray that common reason will come to both grounds. So I'm hopeful of the U.S.
Let's hope so. One question from the audience here. It says, you mentioned that one way to save democracies is to stay off social media. The question is, how can free nations like the US draw the line between ensuring free speech and ensuring its citizens are not being fed misinformation?
That's a great question. I appreciate that. That's actually my colleague's friend, Francis Fukuyama's advice. I was sharing a conversation, and I thought it was illustrative to share his comments. But I partially agree, because the problem with social media is that it creates a post-truth. And let me give you an example. I remember as a child, I was always involved in politics, so I would sit along my cousins or friends, and we would watch the news. And we will all be watching the same news at the living room. And then we would go to dinner, and my family will welcome political discussions, and we had different points of views, but we all watch the same news. But now you get your phone, and you have your cousin, your father, your husband, or your wife. Each of us is looking at the phone, and we are all getting a different version of the same news, because the algorithm is built to show you only one side. So I think that that's actually something that in the beginning was supposed to be a pillar of strength for freedom of speech. I actually developed a number of talks many years ago in Latin America that talked about how the dictators were afraid of the internet, and they were indeed. If you remember the Arab Spring, dictators were truly afraid of social media. Social media through Twitter sparked the protests, for example, in Egypt and Tunisia. However, they hacked the code. Now they understand how to play your mind through algorithms and so on. So I think that I'm openly a classical liberal. In fact, I'm the chairman of Latin America's classical liberals, and I believe in the individual responsibility. Mm-hmm. So I think that no central government should regulate what you read or not. It's your personal responsibility. And unfortunately, there's only one recipe for that. It's education. Yeah. So I would say that we have the responsibility of being disciplined to listen to both sides of the argument, try to read as much as we can. Marxism, for example, said that you only have to read Marx to understand reality. And we know that's something completely absurd. So in the complete opposite side of that argument, if we want to fight disinformation, we have to do a disciplined exercise of understanding reality through different points of views. And at the end of the day, there will always be people that will fall into the traps of propaganda and disinformation, but freedom comes with individual responsibility, and yes, that's the cost. So I rather live with the problems created by freedoms than by a central government telling me what news can I read and which news can I not read.
Access and not. Thank you. I don't know if also this question is for you, but I'll ask it. How bad do you think a second Trump term will really be?
I think that's this for Americans to decide. Mm-hmm. This is a democracy, and that's the cornerstone of democracy. Just trust the process.
Good. Okay. Do you think that the national government in Brazil is headed to an autocracy or democracy?
I've had the pleasure of having a conversation many years ago, and I'm not name dropping here, with President Lula. Mm-hmm. And I remember that I was strongly advised by the organizers of this event that I should not bring Lula's friendship with the dictator Ortega, because I was representing another institution. But I couldn't, as you can tell, I like to talk a lot, so I couldn't hold my words. And instead of being diplomatic, I basically, asked, President Lula why his friendship with the dictator, with a criminal, Of course, he did not respond. It was an uncomfortable moment. However, Lula just stopped Ortega of becoming part of the BRICS in the Russian meeting. He instructed his ambassador in Nicaragua, the Brazilian ambassador, not to attend political party events, that Ortega forces the diplomatic missions to go to political party events. And he strongly criticized Ortega to the point that Ortega has severe diplomatic relationships with Brazil. I'm not saying that the fact that they're not friends anymore automatically makes President Lula into a champion, but brings me to the next point. I think that there's a big difference between political leaders that we disagree and dictators. Mm-hmm. And I might disagree with Lula, as I might disagree with other leaders around the world, but he has clearly shown that he's not a dictator. Probably an example at the global stage is his strong criticism of the Venezuelan election results with Maduro. I think that Maduro was expecting Brazil to give Lula a green light, to give Maduro a green light, and he did not. Mm-hmm. You see, so that tells us that the essence of democracy is that if we agreed on some fundamental principles, no matter if you are a liberal, a conservative, a progressive or not, I mean, we should agree on common grounds. And I think that Brazil is an example of that, as controversial and as polarizing as it is.
What parallels can you share that you've seen applied in your native Nicaragua and now in the US?
I think I see a number, and not only in the US, across the globe, because of course, Nicaragua is a small country, geopolitically speaking. Otto von Bismarck famously said that small countries sometimes produce more history than the history we can consume. And I think that Nicaragua is an example of that. So we've been a country deeply divided by conflict. So we had, as some of you may know, 40 years of a military dictatorship during the Somoza era. Then we had a Marxist dictatorship that was worse than Somoza. Mm-hmm. So those wounds are really open. So I think that one of the common elements that I see is that if we don't overcome our open wounds in terms of ideology, in terms of resentment, it's very hard to build common ground. And then there's always the big possibility that there's going to be a player that will try to manipulate those feelings. The role of the media, so for example, Ortega was able to manipulate the media, the manipulation of social media, which is nothing that was done by Ortega, but clearly by the Chinese and the Russians. I think that that's a problem. And I think it's not a problem of one party or the other. I think that the social media ecosystem in general, it's volatile and has some porosity, so that's also a possibility. So I think that those are common traits that are not a comparison to the US. I think that these are global problems of weak democracy. Yes. And something that doesn't apply to the US in particular, but I would like to say it, I think that taking democracy for granted. We had 16 years of democratic experiment. I am not afraid or shy to say that when Ortega won the elections, I actually cried in front of my family. And some of my closest friends said, "Oh, you're exaggerated. This guy has reinvented himself. He's not the same person." And I don't remember this saying about the leper and the remember in Spanish, in my country, we say, perro que come huevo ni que le quemen el pico. So I'm trying to find what would be the analogy in English, But there are certain types of individuals that would not change ever. So Ortega was always a dictator. It's not that suddenly he became a dictator. He had these autocratic tendencies. And for some reason, a lot of people took democracy for granted. So I think that freedom and democracy is something that needs to be nurtured every single day at every level, at the community level, at the institutional level. We took it for granted, and now Nicaragua has 15% of the population in exile. Just during the first months of the protests in 2018, 350 people were killed as peaceful protesters. Ortega placed snipers on the streets, killing in the first day 55 university students that went unarmed to the streets to protest for freedom.
No, I believe you, because I know that your background is also in peaceful resistance movements. And I myself, I'm originally from Lebanon. I'm American, but from Lebanese descendant, and resistance has been in our lives, whether it's peaceful or non-peaceful. But we've seen sometimes how peaceful resistance, not only in Lebanon, but elsewhere, hasn't been accepted, and people were shot at. And in many instances, these same people had to resort to the armed resistance because the peaceful resistance did not work. So I hear you. Do we have time for a couple of more questions? Good. What words of hope do you have to Nicaraguans still under the Ortega regime?
I think that human nature is inclined to freedom, and I think that dictators can do as much as they can, but at the end of the day, no matter how long it would take, we will continue with the resistance. So the words of hope that I have is that I do have strong day-to-day connections with Nicaraguans inside, and I can tell you that the people in Nicaragua, they continue to resist peacefully. Okay. And we are ready for a democratic transition. Russia and China will not be there all the time. He's trusting, and just as he trusted with the Soviets in the 1980s, once the Soviet Union collapsed, of course, all the satellites couldn't sustain themselves, because the only way to sustain a true government is by giving people the capacity to exercise freedom and liberty. Those regimes are sustained by a foreign influence, such as Cuba. As we know, for example, that Cuba has lost a lot of support, and they cannot even have their electrical system running in the country. It's the same. Ortega is trusting Russia and China, and I believe, I have faith that the Western world will get its acts together and stop the Russian and China influence in the world.
Okay. You said something just a few minutes ago about, and you're right when you said sometimes you need to go deep to understand the main roots of the problem and to try to solve it. And that reminds me of an author, Brown, who says, and I always teach that to my students, that to understand a conflict, you have to look into the root causes, which are the underlying causes, as he refers to, and the triggering factors, triggering causes. So in that context, if you want to deal with the root causes of the problem in Nicaragua, in few words, I
think that the root has to do with institutions. You asked me a question about the U.S., for example, yes, and I will do the analogy. I think that it's not the same to have a political challenge in a country that has robust institutions. And by institutions, I'm using the definition of Doug North, which are the rules of the game, right? Yes. If we have clear rules of the game, no matter how strong the disagreements are, at the end of the day, the rules of the game will allow you to keep your social contract. But in Nicaragua, we never had those robust institutions. And I think that the big failure of the 16 years of democratic transition was to focus on the macro elements, which were, of course, important, trying to bring Nicaragua into free markets. I think that was important, trying to have Nicaragua some basic infrastructure in terms of roads. But I think we didn't pay enough attention to key institutions, particularly in the electoral system. Okay. And there are not only the Sandinistas to blame. Many political parties actually didn't pay enough attention to as legislators to building a robust electoral system. And that will be my concluding note. Elections are not, by definition, everything that has to do with democracy. But democracy, modern democracy, starts with robust elections. So once you start paying attention to elections, the erosion of democracy, of course, is just a matter of time.
It's interesting, if I may say so. We live in a country that markets democracy and human rights and all that. And one aspect of democracy is the elections, is to go through elections, go to the polls and see and listen to what people want and so on. But in many instances, the results that come out of those elections actually surprise those who are advocating for democracy, if you know what I'm saying.
Absolutely, yes.
So if this is not the way, for building democracy, through elections, what is the alternative?
I think that no one has come with a clever and functional alternative to elections.
Okay.
Of course, there are models. I briefly referred to the strongman, model in which elections are not as important as the results. And I think that the most significant example of that is China and Russia. You see that they don't have competitive elections. China has a one-party system. Russia has, of course, a dictatorship. And China can produce cheap, electric cars. They can argue that they are on their way to become a superpower. But I don't see lines and lines of people trying to migrate into China or Russia. I see people trying to come into democracies precisely because even as flawed as the democratic experience is, it proves that it is the only viable alternative that we have. However, I think that becoming merely electoral democracies, this Italian political scientist Giovanni Sartori talked about limited democracy, and he referred that those are those that only focus on elections is a problem. And I think that this is an individual responsibility. We should not exercise political participation only during the time of elections. We should also develop the capacity to oversight and to monitor the performance of politicians. And I think that that's going beyond only the electoral day. And clearly, those countries that have more participative citizens tend to have more robust democracy, because democracy requires the supervision of those who are the owners of the system, which are the people, the citizens, not the elected.
True. One more question. Is it possible to have primaries among the organizations of opposition in exile to elect a leader of the opposition?
I think that there are experiments. It's a huge logistical, challenge.
Okay.
But so the primaries are way more complicated. But there are countries. One example of that is the Tibetan opposition in exile.
Okay.
As you know, the Dalai Lama decided to step down as a political executive leader and just remain as a spiritual leader of the Tibet. And there's a government in exile that had to conduct elections for the government in exile in Dharmarsala. So that's one example. Of course, Belarus is another example. They didn't hold elections, but they had an election in Belarus, and the elected leader whose elections were stolen functions as the democratic leader in exile. So we see models, and I think that with technology we can't get there. The only problem is that when you have, I'm going to use the Nicaraguan example. We have, according to our own census, through Nicaraguan Freedom Foundation, we have diasporas in 42 countries. 75% of them are in 3 countries. So the largest is in Costa Rica, with 800,000 Nicaraguans in Costa Rica, 600,000 Nicaraguans in the United States, and then we have about 320 in Spain. So those 3 countries have a substantial number. But most of them do not have IDs. Some of them have been declared stateless. Some of them are not registered. So how do you do this? It will be tremendously expensive, not impossible. So I think that more than running primaries, when you don't have elections in your own country, is establishing an alternative to power, that the citizens inside the country see that there's an alternative. If you see, for example, countries like North Korea, to give you an extreme example, the problem is that they don't have an alternative. Mm-hmm. If you see countries like Cuba, they don't have an alternative. What if the regime falls in Cuba today? What is the alternative? So instead of thinking about primaries, which I think is a great question, at least at the logistical and theoretical level, is to give those people, Nicaraguans, North Koreans, Cubans, the hope that there's light at the end of the tunnel, that there's an alternative, that is organized, that has a plan, that is not abstract. So oppositions cannot be an abstract idea. They have to be an organized leadership that offers an alternative to power.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your questions.
Please join me to thank Ms. Thank you so much. Thank you. I hope we didn't ask too many questions.
No, they were all